I'm standing in front of the oat maturity trial. Farmers like to use pre-harvest Roundup because it hastens maturity and evens out the field. However, grain millers no longer accept oats which have been treated pre-harvest with glyphosate because it affects the quality of the groat. Swathing is an option, but this is at greater risk of weathering and rejection for milling quality standards. This study looks at the effects of seeding date, plant population, and fertility on oat maturity and quality of oats. Greater attention is going to be required for these management factors without the use of pre-harvest Roundup. Now, here's future me with the results.
Thanks, me. At each location, the following treatments were established. We looked at 2 seeding dates of early and late May, 2 seeding rates of 200 and 300 seeds per meter squared, and 3 nitrogen rates of 40, 65, and 90 pounds per acre. So those combinations give us a total of 12 treatments, but you'll notice there's 14 in the list. That's because treatments 7 and 14 were added to evaluate the impact of reducing the phosphorus rate from 30 pounds per acre to 12.5. This comparison is being made for the early and late seeded oats at the seeding rate of 300 seeds per meter squared and the nitrogen rate of 90 pounds per acre. The following is a list of quality standards that raw oats must meet to be accepted for milling. A lot of these factors are related to weed control and harvest management, but some standards, such as test weight, can be influenced by agronomics. There are other nutritional factors which are not monitored at the front pit, but are of interest to the end user. These include protein, beta-glucans, and fat. Historically, there hasn't been much focus on protein, but this may change as there is greater interest in the market for plant-derived protein. Beta-glucan is now of interest, as a minimum of 4% must be maintained in order to support the heart-healthy claim. The industry isn't as concerned about high fat levels, as most dietitians are now unconcerned about most plant-derived fats. The maximum level of 7.5% fat is now more of a suggestion than a red line not to be crossed. One of the objectives of this study was to demonstrate the benefit of seeding early. Early seeded oats were obviously expected to mature earlier in the calendar year, and they did. However, the number of days it took late seeded oats to reach the hard dough stage was about 10 days less than early seeded oats. In other words, oats were compensating for late seeding. Test weights were expected to be higher for the early seeded oats. This was true at Yorkton and Melfort, but not Indian Head. However, all test weights were well above the minimum requirement of 245 grams per half a liter, which is represented by the red line. Being below 245 doesn't mean rejection necessarily, but oats will be discounted. Yield was expected to be higher for oats seeded early. This did not happen. Early seeded oats yielded 17% less at Yorkton and 5% less at Indian Head. At Yorkton, there was considerable flower blasting with the early seeded oats due to hot temperatures during flowering. Obviously, this had a large impact on yield. Conditions were also warm and dry early in the season at Indian Head, but floral blasting was not noted. Yield at Melfort was unaffected by seeding date. Increasing seeding rate had very little effect on yield at any site. Increasing seeding rate did significantly decrease yield at Indian Head, but the difference was not substantial. Increasing seeding rate was expected to hasten maturity. This was observed at Indian Head, where increasing the seeding rate from 200 to 300 seeds per meter squared hastened maturity by 3 days. Increasing nitrogen rate was expected to increase yield, and that was the case at all locations. Oats were highly responsive to nitrogen at Yorkton and Melfort, up to 90 pounds per acre. At Indian Head, yield plateaued at 65 pounds per acre of nitrogen. Again, I can hear producers saying 90 pounds per acre. If I applied that amount, my oats would go flat. Well, that may be the case. However, we frequently see oat yield responses to nitrogen rates much higher than producers will apply. But apart from lodging concerns, there may be other reasons to hold the nitrogen back, such as hastening maturity when seeding late. At Yorkton, you can see days from seeding to hard dough stage is increasing as nitrogen rate increases. But there's an interaction. increasing nitrogen is delaying maturity more for the late-seeded oats. This means it may be even more important to curb nitrogen for maturity concerns when seeding late. At Indian Head, maturity was also delayed with increasing nitrogen rate. However, the degree of the effect depended on seeding date and seeding rate. Like Yorkton, increasing nitrogen delayed maturity for late-seeded oats more so at the seeding rate of 200 seeds per meter squared. However, the opposite was true for the higher seeding rate of 300 seeds per meter squared, where increasing nitrogen had less of an effect on the maturity of late-seeded oats. Increasing nitrogen rate was expected to decrease test weights, and this did occur at Yorkton and Melfort, but not Indian Head. However, test weights for all locations were well above the minimum target of 245 grams per half a liter, which is represented by the red line. There was a significant yield response to increasing phosphorus rates from 12.5 to 30 pounds per acre at all locations. On average, the yield increase was about 4%. Despite this, no observable effect on maturity occurred.
Other quality factors such as percent thins, protein, beta-glucans, and fat were also evaluated in this study. Thins were never even close to the maximum allowable limit of 10%, and beta-glucans were always well above the 4% required to be considered heart healthy. Fats were a little bit high at Indian Head, approaching the 7.5% maximum limit. However, this limit is now considered more of a suggestion than a red line. Dietitians are becoming less concerned about fats derived from some plants and are now recognizing that there are healthy fats. With the exception of protein, none of these factors were influenced by agronomics, even though some differed substantially between locations. Protein increased with added nitrogen at every location by about 1%. Protein is not currently a concern to the end user, but this may change as the industry focuses on plant-derived protein. Without pre-harvest Roundup to hasten maturity, producers will need to focus more on agronomics. This study has shown that maturity can be hastened by seeding early, increasing seeding rate, and managing nitrogen, particularly if you're seeding late. Nitrogen levels have a big impact on maturity, and it might be worth exploring the value of variable rate nitrogen to manage oat maturity in a variable field. It's still a good practice to keep your phosphorus rates up to hasten maturity, even though we didn't see a big impact of this in our study.